Welcome to Reconciliation Roundtable, where we gather to talk about issues of faith, where I engage with religious leaders to hear of their own spiritual journey, what has moved them forward, what has gotten in the way, inviting their wisdom on how we see the landscape of the world today. My name is Mark Beckwith. I'm the retired bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark. With me today is Dr. Matthew D. Taylor, who is the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. He is the author of Scripture People, Salafi Muslims, and Evangelical Christians America, convener of the audio series Charismatic Revival Fury, the New Apostolic Reformation, and a book to be published in September, The Violent Take It by Force. He's from Southern California, received his master's degree at Fuller Seminary and his Ph.D. from Georgetown in Washington, D.C. His focus has been on religious pluralism. I became acquainted with Dr. Taylor a few weeks ago on NPR on a Saturday morning when he was talking about his upcoming book and specifically talking about the New Apostolic Reformation. And he has a window into that, a passion for it, informing people of this relatively new and somewhat obscure religious movement that I think we all need to know about. So, Matt, welcome to Reconciliation Roundtable.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a privilege to be here.
You grew up in Southern California. You describe yourself then as a fundamentalist / evangelical Christian. You work with InterVarsity ministry on college campuses for 7 years, which is an evangelical ministry. And you decided that you were no longer evangelical theologically. And you switched coasts from California to Washington, D.C., got your Ph.D. in religious pluralism at Georgetown. Can you describe that decision of changing your sort of theological framework? What were the things that were impelling you? What were the questions that you were asking?
Yeah, when you summarize it like that, it sounds so neat and tidy. And our spiritual journeys are rarely that, right? As you summarize there, I really grew up in the world of Southern California evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And up until really 9/11, fundamentalism was a positive identity that a lot of American Christians embraced. And that was kind of the world that I came out of, this kind of enclave culture of evangelical churches, evangelical schools. I was in private school up through college, very much kind of existing in a bubble, in a very kind of conservative evangelical Republican bubble within this much more pluralistic and liberal environment of Southern California. It was while I was working for InterVarsity that InterVarsity, as you said, is an evangelical organization, works on a lot of college campuses. And I went on a mission trip. We weren't supposed to call it a mission trip, but it was a mission trip to Turkey in 2003. And so we were there to try to convert Muslims, but we were doing what we called a lingual cultural exchange. If anybody knows anything about evangelical missions, Turkey was not a country that was receptive to Christian missionaries at the time. And so I was doing a lingual cultural exchange in Turkey. And I was paired up with a Turkish language partner, and I was living with him. We spent a month there. And he was there to learn English. He wanted to practice his English skills. And so there was a little bit of a cynical bargain on both sides of the arrangement, right? I'm trying to win him over for Jesus, and he wants to gain some more English-speaking skills. But we spent a month together and became friends in that process. And I, of course, was very much trying to be as overtly evangelical and religious as I possibly could be and read my Bible every day, even though I didn't do that when I was in the United States, and trying to initiate all these spiritual conversations. And he was a very nominal Muslim, did not go to the mosque, did not pray, did not read the Quran. And this is common among young people in Turkey at the time. And so we get the end of our month together, and he takes me out to dinner. And he says, Matt, I really admire your faith. And I'm thinking, I got him. I got this one. And he said, I've decided I want to become a better Muslim. And I want to start going to mosque, and I want to start reading my Quran. I want to start doing my daily prayers because it's just really inspiring to see your faith. And my evangelical self had a bit of a theological crisis because I couldn't tell if this guy was growing closer to my God or further from my God. This was the opposite of the outcome that I thought I was trying to bring about. And yet he was saying that he wanted to get closer to God. And so this was one in a series of incidents that just started raising all these questions for me about what is going on within Islam. Here is a global religious tradition that is almost the size of Christianity that I know virtually nothing about. And I had gotten a religious studies degree in college. I had taken courses on Islam. I tried, I was in seminary at the time and tried taking courses on Islam at my seminary and realized over a number of years that I didn't want to be a missionary to Muslims. I didn't want to convert them, but I really liked talking to them. I really liked learning from them. And I saw and heard in my conversations with Muslims, people who were similar to me, who were raising questions about scripture, about modernity, about navigating a pluralistic world. And I realized I really want to talk with Muslims for a living. I really want to have theological conversations with Muslims, but not with any agenda other than to learn and to share. And when I tried to talk about that with my evangelical friends, they all kept saying, so you want to be a missionary? I was like, no, I really don't actually. And I realized over time that trying to do interreligious dialogue from within evangelicalism, it was a bit of a cul-de-sac. I couldn't find the resources and the conversation partners and the training that I needed in that space. And so that was about the point where I realized, and there were other theological questions I was grappling with. And I came to the point of realizing, I don't think I'm evangelical anymore. And my wife and I joined a mainline Protestant church at that point. And then I got into the program at Georgetown and did a whole Ph.D. on religious pluralism and Muslim Christian dialogue. And the more I studied Islam, the more I had these moments of deja vu, moments where I'd be talking to Muslims and I heard echoes of my own story. And it wasn't them reflecting back to me my own story. They were telling their stories, but I had these moments of recognition that I was just trying to get underneath. What is going on in those moments of recognition? And that was really the inspiration for my first book.
The person who I'm closest to is not a scholar of Islam, but has developed relationships with the Quran and with others. And she has said, and I feel that when we journey into another tradition, it brings us closer to our own. I lived in Japan for 2 years after I graduated from college and thought about becoming a Buddhist because I was so enamored of organized silence. And what it did is it brought me deeper into my faith. And what I also discovered when I returned to this country, there's a whole raft of silent Christian practice in monastic communities that I knew nothing about. So you made this shift, and in evangelical, as I understand it from some people that I've talked to, it's really a process of helping people get closer to God rather than a specific religious tradition.
Yeah, I would say at least the way the term is used in the United States. I mean, it's gone through many differentiations and connotations over the years, right? Evangelical it's not a stable term. It's not something that you can say, oh, it meant X in the 19th century and it means the same thing today. And this word and this movement keeps morphing and changing over time. And in fact, it's changing very dramatically as we speak. But I would summarize evangelicalism as a trans-denominational form of scriptural piety. Within the kind of Protestant spectrum, of course, all of Protestantism is built around the Bible and sola scriptura and all these things. But for evangelicals, it's very much about personal attachment to the text, the direct access to the text, the sharing of the text, the study of the text, and then the experiences that you have, the spiritual experiences you have in your community around the text, whether through preaching or through worship or those sorts of things. And I think that's kind of the glue that holds, or at least historically has held evangelicalism together. You could argue that maybe that glue is coming apart at the seams a little bit right now. But historically, what has held evangelicalism together is this kind of devotion to Scripture and the inhabitation of the ownership of Scripture. This is why evangelicals go around talking about themselves as the Bible people or the Bible believing Christians, as though the rest of us didn't believe or didn't trust the Bible, right? But for them, there's this deep personal attachment to the text that is about kind of community, but it's also about your own spirituality and how you build it into the story of the Bible.
So you've had this expansive notion of of religious faith as you've studied Islam, and you're part of the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And also, what I have learned and what I heard in the interview with you on NPR a couple of weeks ago is that you have been researching and become an authority. Some have said you are the authority of the new Apostolic Reformation. What led you to that, and what do you want people to know about it?
So I've written a whole book that I want people to know about it, but because of how I grew up and where I grew up, I was hazily aware of the new Apostolic Reformation. It first kind of popped on my screen and a lot of other people's screens around 2008 because Sarah Palin grew up in a new Apostolic Reformation church, and the new Apostolic Reformation was very, very supportive of her. And when she was elevated as the vice presidential candidate, there were a number of news stories that were written about the NAR at the time. And I remember thinking at the time, this is just goofy. It's silly. Here you have modern day Christians claiming they're apostles and prophets, like that's funny. And I had friends and acquaintances growing up who had gotten involved in some of the networks of the NAR, some of the institutions of the NAR. And I was kind of watching them mostly out of amusement up until 2020. And then there was one particular friend or acquaintance growing up who had gone to the same Christian school that I went to, who claimed that he was gifted in dream interpretation. And he had gone to the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministries in Redding, California. And I thought that all of this was just really quite funny. I would sign on to Facebook just to read his dream interpretations of his own dreams. And I thought, how amusing that this guy thinks that he can interpret his own dreams. And when he dreams of Hello Kitty paraphernalia, that's some spiritual significance. And then I watched as he became more and more radicalized over the course of that year, and watched as he would post his dreams, and there would be hundreds of people amplifying this and encouraging him and saying, "Oh, that's awesome! Keep sharing!" Right? And he had this amplifying network that was encouraging him to keep doing this. And then on election day in November of 2020, I saw him post on Facebook an image of himself with a pistol strapped at his hip, and he said, "I'm going to vote." And I thought, there's more to this than I was aware of. What is going on here? And I was actually finishing up my first book at the time. I sent the manuscript of my first book off to the publisher for peer review on the morning of January 6, 2021. And thought that I would have a little bit of a more relaxing day after that. And obviously that's not how that day played out. But in the aftermath of January 6th, as I started trying to read about what were these spiritual expressions, these Christian nationalist expressions, I realized I know something about this, and I wanted to dig deeper. And I had some space while my other book was getting edited. And so I started digging in, and I've spent the last 3.5 years now doing that digging in and writing about the New Apostolic Reformation. In terms of what the NAR is, the New Apostolic Reformation is a term that was coined in 1996 at Fuller Seminary, actually. There was a Fuller Seminary professor named C. Peter Wagner. He and I didn't overlap. I started at Fuller in 2004 and he left in 1999. But he was a longtime Fuller Seminary professor, became fascinated with the non-denominational charismatic world and some of the ideas flowing around the non-denominational charismatic world, especially this idea that God in the 21st century was going to reconstitute the offices of apostles and prophets in the church, right? And if you know anything about Christian history, apostle and prophet, those are very loaded terms and leadership, right?
Sure.
And Wagner and his cohort believed that not only was God doing this work of inaugurating or re-inaugurating the ministry of apostles and prophets, but that they were the apostles and prophets whom God was calling to transform the church. And over time, they became obsessed with politics, and they were fixated on spiritual warfare, fixated on transforming culture. And after Sarah Palin came into politics, and as they became more and more politically radicalized, they became some of the first Christian leaders to endorse Donald Trump. They became many of his religious advisors. And they, after the 2020 election was called for Joe Biden and Donald Trump refused to accept the election, they created a spiritual warfare campaign that was a major contributing force to what happened on January 6th. And many of the core leaders of the NAR were there on January 6th. And I in my book, I call them the principal theological architects of the Capitol riot.
Yeah. Is there a title to this spiritual warfare that they used and have used?
Peter Wagner called it strategic level spiritual warfare was the term that he would use. He also helped coin a term, territorial spirits, which was his way of understanding in the book of Ephesians, it talks about the powers and principalities, this kind of hazy notion of these ominous, dark spiritual forces that are somehow supernatural. But Wagner called those territorial spirits. And he believed that there were demons that controlled literal geographical territory. And that in order for the church to advance, in order for Christianity to advance, for souls to be saved, for the church to gain influence, those territorial spirits that he believed were in every nation and a part of every culture had to be displaced so that Christianity could advance, the church would grow, and so that nations could be transformed.
Wow. As we both know, there is a wide continuum of Christian theology and practice. And what you're describing of the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, would be on the far right. And the mainline church is thought to be on the far left. That's not been my experience, but certainly further to the left. How should more mainline, more established religious traditions, how can they best respond to this growing movement of NAR?
I think the first thing we need to do and the first thing we need to acknowledge is these folks are Christian. As many Christians become aware of the New Apostolic Reformation, and again, this was fringy up until about 2016, and now it's become very, very mainstream very, very quickly because of its association with Donald Trump. But for a long, long time, evangelicals and mainline Protestants who became aware of the NAR would often call it a cult, would often call it a form of heresy, would often dismiss it as silly or goofy or extreme. Again, some of the same sentiments I had when I first encountered this stuff, and would try to kind of bracket it off and say, that's not Christianity, or that's not my Christianity, and so therefore I have no responsibility for it. The challenge is that these folks are doing Christian theology. They have other things that they're doing, right? They have distinctives within their Christian theology, but we all have distinctives within our Christian theology. There is no generic Christian out there. And these folks are using the name of Jesus. They are praying. Their spirituality is built out of the Bible. They're quoting and citing the Bible. And they are doing these things, including what happened on January 6th. They are doing that in our names. And so I think we as fellow Christians need to take some responsibility here and acknowledge we have a stake in this. And this affects us too. And we have some responsibility. These are our Christian sisters and brothers. And I don't think we get ourselves off the hook by saying, oh, well, they're bad Christians or they're not real Christians. So I think we're coming to a time where we need to have a reckoning in global Christianity, and particularly within American Christianity, about some of the radicalization that has started and is ongoing and is getting worse within American Christianity. And I worry, because I speak at all kinds of mainline Protestant, liberal, Catholic churches, and I think there's this sentiment of, that's not me, so I don't have to deal with it. But it is you, because it's being done in your name. And I think we all have a responsibility to speak up in this moment against Christian nationalism, against Christian extremism, and to call it out theologically and to have dialogue across these different forms of Christianity, because we have become incredibly theologically siloed along with our political polarization. And that's a very dangerous condition for the American church to be in.
How do you see this reckoning taking place between mainline, more progressive Christians and the NAR? What I'm hearing you say is that they are our brothers and sisters. They claim the same faith. How do we reckon with them?
Well, part of the challenge, particularly the challenge, then I'll try to offer some thoughts on how to get there. Because part of the challenge is that we really have become extremely siloed. And liberal Christians don't talk to conservative Christians. And that's true within Protestantism. That's true denominationally. That's true Catholicism, right? We've separated out into red Christianity and blue Christianity. And so in our social circles, apart from maybe the Thanksgiving table where we're forced to confront some of our family members who may inhabit the same faith traditions, but inhabit them very differently than us. We really exist in our own little bubbles. And I think it's easy for us to become self-congratulatory in those bubbles. Look how progressive my church is. Look at the good we're doing in the community. Or look how conservative and stalwart my church is. And in that environment, it becomes very easy to dismiss our fellow Christians and to pretend like they are not the people whose spirituality and religion impinges on us. But right now, there is an ongoing, and I don't use this term lightly, I study radical political movements. There is a radicalization of American Christians that's going on. Mm-hmm. And it's a radicalization. I sometimes talk about it. We talk a lot about Christian nationalism, and that's a real thing. But Christian nationalism is a big spectrum.
Sure.
There's all kinds of forms of Christian nationalism, all kinds of different theologies of Christian nationalism. And a lot of Christian nationalists in the United States, it's a hazy, sentimental thing for them. They are nostalgic for an America they imagine once existing. They're carrying around mythological ideas about how America was founded as a Christian nation and a lot of kind of bad history in there. But it's very passive for a lot of people who are Christian nationalists. Right? You ask them, okay, well, what you want America to be a Christian nation? What does that mean? They're like, no, I want more love in our government. Like, okay, that's fine, right? Like, that doesn't sound like a great threat to American democracy. But there is a hardened edge of American Christian nationalism that I call Christian supremacy that is growing. And that's where the NAR is. The NAR is a form of Christian supremacy. They believe that Christians are better than other people, that God has mandated for Christians to take control of society, to govern from the top down, to coercively arrange society, to privilege Christianity over every other worldview and faith tradition or philosophy. And that impacts all Christians. So I think part of what I'm trying to encourage my fellow mainline Protestants, my liberal Catholic friends, my centrist evangelical friends, part of what I'm trying to encourage is I think we need to try to win over some of the hazy Christian nationalists. I don't think we can actually win over the NAR. I've interviewed a lot of these leaders. They are far gone.
They far gone. Do you mean, say more of what you mean by far gone?
They are far gone politically. They believe that they have the truth with a capital T, mm-hmm. and that anyone who disagrees with them is not a real Christian. And they have become the enemies of American pluralism. They have become the enemies of the separation of church and state. And I don't believe that most of them can be persuaded. I think there's people within that world who can be persuaded, but Jim Wallace likes to make the distinction between figuring out who is persuadable, those are the people we need to focus on, and who needs to be defeated. I think within our politics, the NAR needs to be defeated.
Okay.
They need to be shown that their vision of Christian supremacy is not acceptable in American pluralism. But I think there's actually a lot of room for people who are somewhere on the rest of the Christian nationalist spectrum, people who have kind of religious patriotism as part of their worldview. I think there's room for talking to those people and saying, hey, look, I get it. You believe that America should be a Christian nation. Can we agree that everyone is entitled to the same rights? Can we agree that everyone should have religious freedom? And if you can agree with that, then you're for pluralism with the rest of us.
Right.
And the problem is these extremists over here.
One of the commitments that engages me is my work with Braver Angels, which formed after the 2016 election, initially called Better Angels, referring to Lincoln's first inaugural, appealing to the better angels of our nature. Another group had that. Now we renamed ourselves Braver Angels because we need to be braver. And it's a movement to depolarize America, not to pull one side to the other, but can we find common ground? So it has grown throughout the country. Thousands and thousands of people are a part of this. I refer to Braver Angels as the secular version of the Anglican movement. I've been an Episcopalian Anglican my whole life, and we were created an incredible tension between Protestant and Catholicism. And what I've discovered is that there's a place called the mandorla, Italian word for almond, which is the shape that's created when two circles intersect. In medieval art, it was the intersection between heaven and earth. Today, I think it's the intersection between red and blue, between conservative and more progressive. And as you say, there are people at the outer edge who won't leave their circle, But there are more and more people, I think, who, at least as I listen to them, they want to be in that mandorla space, which is what I hear you talking about. Is there common ground? I find actually when I'm engaging with people who are more conservative than I am, it reinforces some of my beliefs, but a deeper respect or a deeper understanding of what needs to happen to have this reckoning, as you call it.
Yeah, and I do interreligious dialogue for a living. I mean, that's what our institute does, is we gather groups of Muslims and Christians and Jews and nuns to come and talk, to come and do dialogue, to come and learn from each other. And I am under no illusion about how hard that is, right? That is a very difficult thing to get people from different worldviews. But I actually think often it's easier to do inter-religious dialogue than to do intra-religious dialogue. It's easier for liberal Christians and liberal Jews and liberal Muslims to talk with each other than for liberal Christians and conservative Christians to talk to each other. And that's because we have separated ourselves out culturally into these different camps. We've sorted ourselves into these networks where we feel comfortable, where people are like us. But the challenge is that the United States as a democracy is coming apart at the seams right now. And I'm not being hyperbolic there. Like, really, I am dialed in to some of the most extreme groups in the country right now. The militias, the extremist Christians, the people who are behind January 6th. And there is momentum gathering in that world. And I don't know where that momentum is going, but it's not going anywhere good, right? And it is anti-pluralism. It is anti-democracy. It is anti-rule of law. They would be very happy with an authoritarian state that gives them the Christianity and the Christian privilege that they want. And I think those of us who are citizens, those of us who are Christians of good faith, people who care about our society, we need to be stepping up at this moment and recognizing that some of our fellow Christians pose a real threat to American democracy. And that doesn't mean we need to demonize those people or dehumanize those people. I want to humanize all of them. I want to say, hey, I'm a human being, you're a human being, I'm a Christian, you're a Christian. Can we all inhabit the society together and be committed to the rule of law, be committed to pluralism, be committed to everybody having equality and the same rights?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned spiritual warfare, which is one of the main messages of the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation. This podcast is called Reconciliation Roundtable, and deeply committed to reconciliation. My particular tradition has a 500-year history of being committed to that, better at times than others. How do you see the interplay between spiritual warfare and reconciliation? How do you hold those two things together?
I think I grew up in communities that practiced spiritual warfare, that believed in spiritual warfare. And for those who might be listening who aren't as familiar with spiritual warfare, the basic concept is there are angels and demons who are battling in the invisible world that impacts the real world. And that Christians can participate in those battles through prayer, through worship, through spiritual practices. And a lot of that is practiced individually, right? I'm feeling oppressed. I need to kind of pray right now, or I feel like there are spiritual forces attacking my community. We need to gather and pray. I think that is fine. That doesn't worry me. What worries me are these NAR ideas of strategic spiritual warfare, where they imagine that they can transform American culture through violent rhetoric and through casting out demons. And what they do in the midst of that is that they point at their enemies, including their fellow Christians, and say, those people are not rational. Those people are not themselves. It's demons inside of them that is driving them to do the things that they do. Lance Wallnau, who's a major NAR leader, who was very important for what happened on January 6th, one of the most important Christian propagandists for Donald Trump, said a few weeks ago on his TV show, he said, we're coming to the point in this election where the people on the left, you can't even hear them speaking anymore because it's just demons speaking through them. Now, when you think about reconciliation, right? Reconciliation assumes the dignity and humanity of the other person, right? It assumes that this is a human being, and whether that reconciliation is happening among Christians or between Christians and people who are not Christians, it assumes the dignity and humanity of the other person. And it says, we have to kind of work together and find where we can agree. And also we have to acknowledge where we have grieved and harmed each other. And part of what deeply, deeply worries me about these NAR notions of spiritual warfare, especially the strategic spiritual warfare, is it is very effective at demonizing your opponents, literally demonizing your opponents and saying, I don't have to listen to you. I don't have to think about your worldview. I don't have to even acknowledge the validity of the points that you are making because I can just chalk them all up to demons. And this rhetoric of spiritual warfare is becoming infused more and more into our politics. And it is driving, it's pushing this wedge of polarization into our politics. Because as long as your enemies are demons, then you must be on the side of the angels. And as long as your enemies are demons, you don't have to compromise. You don't have to listen. You can just sit in your little silo and feel self-righteous and feel that your agenda is the righteous one. And all you need to do is deliver them of their demons, and then they'll agree.
Several writers have said a variation of this, that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And what you're describing is a movement that is based on certainty. And I think this answers the question, given just all the things that are happening in the world and the chaos and the rapid change, is the attraction to NAR about certainty, about violence? What is drawing people to this? Presumably they're effective speakers who speak to people's vulnerability or their desire to have everything figured out. But what do you see as the attraction of this growing movement?
We are living in a very cynical age, especially when it comes to institutions. People are very distrusting of institutions. We're very distrusting of quote unquote organized religion. And I say this as a religious studies scholar.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as disorganized religion. When things are disorganized, there's a leadership vacuum, and entrepreneurial leaders are going to step in and fill that vacuum. But part of this disaffection with institutions is what is fueling the attraction of the NAR. Because what they say is, don't trust your denominations, don't trust your churches, invest in the capital authority of individuals, invest in the charismatic personalities of these apostles and prophets, because they hear directly from God. They'll even sometimes call themselves oracles. We are oracles who hear directly from God. And then what they do is they create churches that have worship experiences that are immersive. It feels like the most high-powered rock concert you've ever been to, but filled with spirituality, and filled with supernatural manifestations, and filled with people speaking in tongues, and filled with perceived miracles. And I think that it has proven incredibly attractive for many Christians who are looking for somewhere to anchor their faith. And especially during COVID, these were a lot of the churches that stayed open, that defied the local COVID restrictions and gave the middle finger to their counties and to their governors and said, no, we're staying open. And they have benefited enormously from that. All the Christians who are angry at their churches for closing down, who were resentful of COVID restrictions, have all migrated into these independent charismatic churches, these non-denominational charismatic churches. And so it's a lively spirituality, and they are telling people, you are part of something extraordinary. You are part of a global revival movement that is going to transform the world, right? And we have these dynamic apostles and prophets who are leading this movement. And look how connected they are to Donald Trump. Look how connected they are to political power. That can be your power because God is on our side. God is with us. God is blessing our movement. And that's a very compelling narrative for a lot of Christians who feel disempowered, who feel they're desperate to reclaim their culture. And so the NAR has been proven very effective at migrating people over from this kind of mushy Christian nationalism into this hardened Christian supremacy.
Early on in his civil rights career, as somebody who was at a meeting where Martin Luther King came in and proceeded to take over the meeting, somebody said to him, Martin, what we need are movement-centered leaders, not leader-centered movements. And what you're describing, my guess, is that the leaders of these churches, the spirit, the delineation of who are infected by demons is mediated through the leader. The leader is the one who knows, and people need to put their trust in the leader. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, in my book, because again, we're not talking about denominational Christianity. This is amorphous, Wild West, non-denominational space. And I actually call the model of the NAR, the model of leadership, a spiritual oligarchy.
Yeah.
The apostles and prophets become these global celebrities who are these icons of religious devotion, and they are setting up their own little fiefdoms, these apostolic networks and prophetic channels on YouTube, where they gain all these followers, but they are separate from the rest of the church.
Yeah.
Because they're these special anointed leaders, these oracles who can hear from God. But then everyone else kind of follows after them. And because these prophets have so attached themselves to Donald Trump and attached all these prophecies to Donald Trump, it has created this quasi-messianic movement around Donald Trump, where they believe that he is anointed by God to perform certain tasks in this world and realign America around their vision. And for their followers, that has just been a magnetic set of ideas. But it's all premised, again, on this oligarchic approach to spiritual authority. It's not democratic. It's not rooted in communities. It's rooted in these individual leaders.
Sure. And I'm wondering if somebody makes a mistake, any of these leaders, and Donald Trump is now facing a reckoning around the mistakes that he made, at least in New York, around his business. Can a mistake be so egregious that one loses faith in the leader? And then I guess presumably there's another one to take their place.
Yeah, that's the beauty and the terror of an oligarchy.
Yeah.
It's a form of authoritarianism, but it's not centered on one person. And so that class of oligarchs can expand and shrink. People can get knocked out, others can get added in. And so the personalities of the leaders can change, but the structure remains the same. And for these folks, they recognize that Donald Trump is a very flawed human being. They recognize he's not a good Christian. But in their theology, the concept is what they talk about as the seven mountains. You can divide society up into these seven different arenas of influence: government, family, education, media, and on and on. And Christians, in their view, need to conquer the seven mountains, take over these arenas of influence, because it's either God or the devil that rules over those seven mountains in every society, right? Or it's either the territorial spirits or the church that rules over those mountains. And to conquer the government mountain, to conquer the education mountain, you don't have to be a good Christian. You just have to be somebody who's willing to govern in alignment with Christian interests. And so they have invested all of this authority and spirituality around Donald Trump, saying he's going to take the government mountain for us, and then our power will increase in society. And then Christianity will become dominant in society. And so they're very willing to be flexible on ethics and on the peccadillos of particular leaders if they see it as accomplishing their agenda.
Dr. Matt Taylor, thank you so much for sharing your passion for investigating something that we all need to know about, because this is becoming more and more a part of our life, something that we don't want to pay attention to. And your eloquence and your commitment are sort of bringing it out as such that we need to look at all of this. I want to thank you for this time together and for all that you do and continue to do. Matt, how can people follow you, find you on social media or other places?
So I created a podcast series called Charismatic Revival Fury that's all about the New Apostolic Reformation. In January 6th, you can just search Charismatic Revival Fury. It's on all podcast platforms. You can find it online. I'm on Twitter. My handle is @TaylorMatthewD, and people are welcome to follow me there. I'm on Substack and LinkedIn, all the platforms. But I work at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, as you said. And if you go to ICJS.org, you can sign up for our email updates. We're constantly running educational programs around interreligious dialogue, around Christian nationalism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. And most of our stuff is online. All of our programs are free to the public. So please avail yourself of that. And we have a back catalog. A lot of our old programs, the things we've done in the last few years, are all up on YouTube. So I've taught courses on Christian nationalism and Messianic Judaism and all these things there. And that's all available on our YouTube channel as well.
Okay, great. Well, enormous resource to this time together, but also beyond that, as you've just described. And look forward to your book coming out, The Violent Take It by Force, to be published in September. Again, I'm Mark Beckwith, convener of Reconciliation Roundtable, retired bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark, author of Seeing the Unseen, Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. I can be followed at markbeckwith.net. Again, thank you. Blessings on your work, on your ministry, on your witness.
Thank you, Mark.